Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of the Nailed It Ortho podcast, where it is our job to talk about different orthopedic topics and try to get you guys well versed in it, as well as being able to handle kind of something comes in, being able to handle it and manage that, as well as answer some questions. But this episode is going to be a little bit different. We wanted to kind of just change the context of different things that we talk about. So I'm gonna let. Oh, I didn't even introduce myself, you all. I'm Dr. Cole, one of the co-hosts to this podcast, and I'm joined here by.
Yeah, and see, guys, that's why I'm here. I have to keep them together, guys. I'm Dr. J Fitz, guys. We're going to go ahead and get going, okay? So, like we said, this is a little different of a topic, but I think it's going to be able to fit a lot of people right now, with the younger generation being a little bit more active on social media. Some of the older docs out there maybe trying to see how to incorporate it into their practice and things like that. We brought on Dr. Nancy Shipley, who is a sports medicine doctor who is very active with social media, as well as have a very active sports medicine practice as well. She did her residency at the Virginia Commonwealth in Richmond, Virginia, and she did her fellowship training in arthroscopy and sports medicine at the Orthopaedic Research in Virginia. We happened to come across Dr. Shipley, and we came up with a lot of great topics that she could talk about instantly. I mean, she has a amazing personality, but we decided to do something a little different and talk about how to use social media for the orthopedic surgeon. So guys, with no further ado, I hope you guys really enjoy this one. This might be something new that we try to do and add some different little topics in on things. So enjoy.
You are now listening to Nailed It, the Orthopedic Surgery Podcast, featuring Doctors Jay Fitz and Wendell Cole.
Welcome to the Nailed It podcast. Today we have a very special guest. So excited. I've actually been looking forward to having this conversation with our guest, Dr. Shipley. So welcome so much to the show, and thanks for being on.
Thanks. So happy to be here.
Oh yeah, and I know we have this is a little different than our typical talk. Listeners, you'll understand why we say that here in a bit. But I think it's a good topic, and I think it'll be really interesting. But first, kind of just to start off, just getting to know you a little bit better. We see that you're a sports trained physician or orthopedic surgeon. So kind of what made you choose sports? You know, the age-old question.
Yeah, so I did my residency at Virginia Commonwealth in Richmond, Virginia, and I did my fellowship at Orthopaedic Research Virginia, so it's known as the so-called Casperry Fellowship. I was drawn to sports because of the patient population. I just really enjoy taking care of athletes, and actually my favorite type or level of athlete to take care of is recreational, and I also really enjoy taking care of high school athletes as well. Although I don't do much in the way of peds, I do take care of older teens, and I cover the local high school football team as well. I just enjoy the level of motivation that my patients have to get back to their lifestyle, and whether that's recreational sports or just kind of maintaining their level of activity. There's a lot of reward in that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Because I've been on the opposite side too when I was a patient, and I suffered an injury, the dreaded ACL tear, as many orthopedic surgeons have the same story. I found that to be one of the big things. I'm also interested in sports, and I think that's one of the things that kind of attracts me to it as well. So awesome, Fitz. I know you had some questions you wanted to ask her.
Yeah, that's just to throw my little 2 cents in. That I'm like one of the rare orthopedic docs who don't really have that story of sports in my background. I never played any sports back in my younger years, so that was always something that just kind of came up during interview time. I'm like, oh no, I never really played any sports, but yeah. Anyway, Dr. Shipley, this is kind of going more towards our actual talk today. We happen to know that you're very into speaking and into social media. And we just wanted to ask you what kind of started that that interest of just speaking to large audiences and things like that?
So I started doing some speaking. All of us going through medical school residency do presentations, and we'll present at our rounds and whatnot. But I have the opportunity here in private practice in Portland, Oregon, to work with hospital systems that I'm privileged at that. I'm in private practice, but I work with Providence, and they have a program called Ortho Watch, where they brought high school students in from all over the state. And these students were involved with a kind of a healthcare career focused program. So these students would come in, and I would do a lecture in the morning. It's always great to get 14, 15, 16-year-olds up at 6 in the morning where they're bleary-eyed, they're teenagers.
Oh, yeah.
But I would give them a talk on a surgery that I would be doing, and then they would live mic me up and head up to the OR and perform a surgery while they watched it live. So they got to watch it on camera, listen into everything that I was talking about, whether it be to the rest of the surgical team, or sometimes the moderator down at the auditorium would shoot up some questions, and I'd be able to answer them while I was doing the surgery. It just so happens that the surgery was an ACL surgery, which Wendell, you have experience with.
Oh, yes, I do.
On both sides. And it was just cool. I really enjoyed interfacing with the high school students in that way. And then after I was done with the surgery, I would come down and give them a kind of a debriefing about what we did, take questions and answers. And I would also make sure to talk a little bit about my own personal path to medicine and to orthopedic surgery, because I was atypical in a number of different ways. I was a so-called non-traditional medical student because I took several years off after college. And I write and I blog about, just my path into medicine, and how I got there. And also being female, there just aren't a lot of women that go into orthopedics. Now that's changing, fortunately, but, I always make sure I talk a little bit about, not just the clinical aspects of the surgery that I do, but also just my path there, especially because these are teenagers. These are kids that want to go into medicine and healthcare. So that kind of got me started with speaking and having an interest in speaking. And then just my need for having a creative outlet got me into blogging, and that led to just being a little bit more active on social media.
Well, there it is. Okay. Well, and that kind of brings us to the topic of the talk today. What do you think? I know since you've been doing this, and like you say, that's been your kind of your creative outlet for some time now. What role do you think social media plays for the physician in today's time?
I think that it's a great opportunity for physicians to get out there, and it actually serves a number of different roles. It really depends on the goal of the individual. Obviously, just like you guys are doing, there is a role for education, and that can be education of the general public. It can be education of your peers. It can be education for future surgeons, future orthopedic surgeons. It's also a great way to network. And you'll also see a lot of physicians on there where they use social media more for self-fulfillment and for their other hobbies or even side hustles. They may be talking about things that have nothing to do with orthopedics or even nothing to do with medicine, but because being a physician is part of their identity, they will kind of have that as part of their profile as well. But it really just depends on the individual's goals.
Now, in what you do, is there a specific platform that you favor over the others? It's like such as Instagram or Facebook, or do you favor Twitter, or do you kind of just use all of them generally? I'm definitely most active on Instagram. And I've also more recently become more active on Twitter.
And it's interesting. I've learned that the different platforms have different purposes, and you'll also get different types of followers on the various platforms. Using just my own experience as an example, on Instagram, I include a little bit of lifestyle, a little bit of the work that I do, and by far my biggest followership tends to fall into the pre-med or med student or even resident kind of arena. And I try to keep things lighthearted. I include a little bit of just, what it's like to be a surgeon, and not just the clinical part of it, but lifestyle and what it means to be a parent and a surgeon, a mom and a surgeon, what it's like to live here in Portland and be a surgeon. So I have sort of a pretty varied, I have pretty varied content that I put on there. And it just kind of gives you a slice of, what my life is like. But I'm also on Twitter, and I found that on Twitter, I tend to connect more with my orthopedic colleagues, and the discussions can range anywhere from discussing healthcare policy or orthopedic cases, or other things that are pertinent to a practicing surgeon.
Now, do you ever use social media as far as do you ever get not consults, but do you ever get referrals, from social media? Let's say, hey, somebody was following you, a patient end up seeing you, and the way that they say that they heard about you was through Instagram or through, Twitter or one of those outlets.
I would say, as far as getting referrals for patients, that comes more from my connections that I've made with other physicians, as opposed to people who have sought me out on social media. And I think that's mainly because, especially with my larger following on Instagram, it tends to be more people who aspire to do what I do, like the pre-meds, as opposed to people looking for orthopedic information at least on my Instagram account. Mm-hmm. I would say that those that want to come in to see me as a patient or end up seeing me as a patient may encounter the material that I put out on my website more, and may find me that way. But it tends to, as far as kind of generating clinical business and getting patients, that's more maybe the stuff that I put out on my website. I try to put more of the patient-focused information out on my website and also on my blog.
I see. And towards the Instagram account, do you think that the information you putting out is more so geared towards the medical students and residents, and or do you just think that's the crowd that's kind of on that platform that's more likely to just happen to come across your page?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that as I was putting content out, looking at it analytically, I would see what there seemed to be more of a demand for. And, I could post about something and have no one really care, or I could post about something else like, what was involved in getting into med school, or maybe what my typical week is like. And then I'd get a lot of interest. So that sort of drove what I would produce more of and put more of on my account. So, I think that just depending on who you are and what you do and what you initially put out there, it may kind of steer you in one direction or another just based on who your followers are and what your followers want.
Mm. And so how do you think, us as physicians, even residents or even say med students that are, going into residency, or even there might be some attendings listening to this, how do you think that they can take advantage of social media? Like, what do you think that they can do to, I guess, not for say ride the wave, but, take advantage of what this has to offer?
I think there is so much potential out there for physicians utilizing social media. And, like some of the things I mentioned above, it's a great way to educate your patients. It may or may not be a way to kind of gain more patients or gain more referrals, but it is a great vehicle to continue to educate existing patients or the general public. I think that, you can take advantage of social media if you stay focused on your ultimate goals. If it's very easy to get sucked down into the rabbit hole of social media, both professionally and personally. And so I think one of the key things to remember is what are your motivations in getting onto social media as a physician, and what are your ultimate goals? And then you can refine what you're doing on there to remain focused and true to your goals and true to your brand, whatever your brand is.
And you kind of almost hit on it there. What are some of the pitfalls you think that someone can kind of fall victim to with social media sometimes that can actually be a negative more so towards their career?
Yeah, I think staying focused helps you refine what you're putting out there, because it's very easy to get on social media and just kind of feel like you're on there a lot and spinning your wheels and spending all the time doing it. And if you don't kind of keep your goal in mind, then it can be a complete time suck. You can really get sucked down the rabbit hole. And find yourself chit-chatting with a lot of people and interacting with people, but not really staying true to what your goals are and what your brand is. I think another really big thing that, in particular us as physicians and other healthcare providers really have to watch out for is HIPAA. Right. Just being very, very careful about what is being posted. I think in the strictest sense, even if you don't talk about who your patient is, you don't have any identifiers, but you're saying, hey, look at these pictures. Here I am in the OR today, and here's an intraoperative photo of somebody with a clavicle fracture. This was the first case of my day. Well, maybe people out there across state lines may not know, but if someone happens to have access to, or somebody locally says, oh, well, I know who this is. This person was the first case of so and so day. Then you run into some HIPAA violations, and we all know that can be pretty stiffly penalized. And so, if I do have, everyone who comes through my clinic does sign a agreement that I may use anonymous images, whether it's radiographic images or intraoperative images, for educational content, and that it does remain anonymous. I am still very, very careful about not posting specifics about a case on that day, saying this is what I'm doing right this minute. I really keep things very generic. And if I have something educational, maybe it's a cool fracture that I did, or maybe, a total shoulder I did that was an interesting case, I just don't post it on that day, so that you can't trace that back. So I think that's, for physicians, that's like one major pitfall of publicizing anything that you're doing clinically. Another thing that I would want to point out with social media, with how visual of a medium it is that even outside of what we're doing clinically, especially when it comes to lifestyle stuff that people might be posting, it's really important to remember that the internet is forever. Yeah. It just will never go away. And so just what you post, whether it is something visual or something that you say, I think before you do it, because, you can get in trouble with something that you say if it's like overly political or it's inflammatory, or, don't post after you've had a couple beers, at least not on your public profile,
right?
Because that can get dicey. I always say, especially if there's a potential patient that might be thinking about having you as their physician, you just want to be careful what you're posting. And if it's something that you wouldn't want your grandmother's bridge partner to be seeing or reading, then maybe don't put it on the internet.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've because I follow a couple orthopedic pages, at least on Instagram, and I've seen a couple times where there'd be patient identifiers, like such as like obvious tattoos and things like that in the picture. So I know I've definitely seen it. I know it's something that can be that can be violated a lot, because I know I've seen it before. And
yeah.
And I know you've built a following on Instagram. What tips do you have for like building a social media presence?
I think that what's gonna be best for growing your social media presence is quality content and authenticity. And of course, with certain platforms like Instagram, it's very visual. And so there's always the conundrum of like, what do I need to post that's going to visually grab somebody? Because that may be what brings people initially in to kind of look on your page and stay on your page. Having something visually pleasing as far as just the overall look is helpful, but you're not going to get really good engagement. You're not going to get really good followership where people are going to repeatedly come back and engage with you and look at your content if it is not something of value, and not something authentic. And so, I think that there are some things to learn from the really popular Instagram accounts as far as, what's visually appealing, what is balanced to the eye. There is that design component. You can't ignore that on a platform like Instagram. But ultimately, there needs to be good stuff, good quality stuff on there that your followers are going to want to come back for. And it's got to provide some kind of a value. Otherwise, it's going to be empty.
All right. Now, do you typically plan your posts, or is it just as you go, you just post things as life happens?
It's a little bit of both. I started out not planning very far ahead, and I'm in practice, and I have a family and kids, and it can end up being really very time consuming. And so I have found it to just make much more sense to me to actually plan my posts. And I use one of those platforms to just sort of push things out in a timely fashion on a regular basis. But, I'll create stuff and I'll write stuff when I have a chunk of time. So I batch. So I do batch. But for example, like on Instagram and Twitter, I will, if something newsworthy comes up, then I'll post it on either of those platforms where it's relevant to today, or what's going on in the news right now. I utilize Instagram stories to just, that doesn't take a lot of time for me to say, hey, I'm headed to the OR today, or, oh, hey, I've got a busy clinic today. And, and maybe I'll give some tips or just kind of pearls. And that'll be more on the fly. Those just tend to be a little bit more spontaneous.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And I know on your Instagram page, you have a pretty good following. I was just wondering, about how long do you think it took you to kind of get to where you are now as far as on Instagram?
I've been on Instagram now probably about 1.5 to 2 years. And so, I think that trying to identify what kind of topics are of interest and what kind of content is of interest has been really helpful with growth. I think engagement is helpful. I engage with the followers personally. I answer questions when I get private messaged the best that I can. And I think that has been instrumental in kind of building the followership. And kind of going back to other pitfalls, sometimes I do get questions about, hey, I've got this problem. What would you suggest? And you got to be really careful with making it clear that we are not establishing a doctor-patient relationship. I'm not giving medical advice. If it's kind of generalities, like if somebody messages me about like, hey, I want to know if what I should do about my spine. Clearly that's like totally outside of my scope. I'm not going to give medical advice, first of all, anyway, but I may tell this person, I was like, I can't engage with you in that way, but what you probably should do is talk to somebody who's a specialist in spine. And if you establish yourself as a patient with somebody, then they'll be able to give you much better advice. And so I really keep things generic and just am very cautious about, giving the impression that I'm offering any kind of medical advice at all. So I'm very clear about that. And I also even, include that in my profile. It kind of seems odd to even have to say it, but I put on there, Instagram is not a source of medical advice.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's like, oh, of course, but you kind of have to, because there are always going to be those inquiries.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's actually a great point to bring up, because you never know. You don't want to get into, any issues that you don't have to be in. I think this was a pretty awesome talk. I actually enjoyed it, just kind of having a brief overview of some of the things in social media that could be helpful for our careers if you choose to use it.
Yeah.
Sound like he was kind of saying, well, I'll ask. So let's compare the new attending, young attending going into his career versus the attending who say has been around for 25, 30 years. That's a little long. 20 years, somewhere in there, around 20 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, how important do you think the use of social media is for those two? One who's been around for a long time who hasn't used it versus one who's brand new and about to start a brand new career?
I think that there is a role in social media for anybody. It is, and it may depend on how tech savvy an individual is, but honestly, even if you introduce something like how to tweet to someone who is, maybe not in the generation where they're super comfortable, it's still easy to learn how to do some basics. And like Twitter, you'll find people of all age demographics, but you'll find folks that are, I'm squarely in Generation X, but, even the next generation older than me, you'll find folks on Twitter who can talk about really meaningful stuff and things that are meaningful to them. And they can be a great source of education and pearls and insights from somebody who's been out for several years that you may not get from a newer attending or a resident. And so I don't think that, age or duration of years that they've been in practice really should be a barrier. I think that the general public, as well as us as physicians and residents, have something to learn from people, no matter where they are in training. And it's great to connect. I liked it, when I started getting on Twitter, I really liked how it was the great equalizer. It's like everyone's equal on Twitter. You can engage with somebody who you normally maybe wouldn't walk up to and have a casual conversation with on Twitter. And it's actually really, really cool in that way. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm Twitter chattering with
whatever
twittering. Yeah. See clearly, like I'm still learning. Right. But I'm tweeting with the chairman of whatever, and it really is this great equalizer where you can have a conversation with somebody about your work and about whatever that, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you would not have been able to.
Absolutely. And that kind of, I think that's a great way to start wrapping this talk up. We always end our shows with asking our guests, is there a way that they like for the listeners to come by and be able to reach out to them? And I know for you, because this is a talk on social media, I'm sure you have a couple different ways. So, Dr. Shipley, what are some of the ways some of our listeners could reach out to you if they just wanted to speak with you or had any questions or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me at my website. It's www.nancymd.com. I also have a YouTube channel, which is kind of in its fledgling year or two, but I'm putting more helpful content on there, both for aspiring surgeons and for the general public. And my handle on YouTube is also Nancy MD. I am on both Instagram and Twitter with the handle _Nancy MD. And those are probably the places where you'll find me most active. So happy to reach out or talk to any of your listeners on there with questions pertaining to whatever, social media, orthopedics, open to it. And I generally am very engaging on there. So happy to chat.
Yeah, Dr. Shipley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking. Really enjoyed it. I think it was a great talk. I think the people will get something out of it. And we really just wanted to, again, say thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for listening to yet another episode of the Nailed It Orthopedic podcast. We hope you guys enjoyed it. We wanted to, switch things up a little bit with Dr. Shipley here and do a episode on social media. So we hope you guys enjoy a little bit of variety there. For any show notes, as well as to follow us and stay in contact with us, you can go to nailedItOrtho.com for show notes as well as links to other shows. You can follow us on Instagram at nailedItOrtho. And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at nailedItOrtho@gmail.com. Until next time.